Psalm 46 is another one of my absolute most favorite psalms. It speaks so clearly of God's kingdom, God's river of life, God's protection. And remember, all these psalms that deal with God's protection, they are generally, for the most part, dealing with the plan of salvation, the protection that we have in Jesus. And specifically, obviously, the new covenant was designed for Israel and Judah. But we also see so many passages, even in the Psalms, of how Gentiles would ultimately come to their light, to, as Isaiah says, the brightness of their rising. And so all of these promises that we see in the book of Psalms in regard to the kingdom apply to Gentiles who have entered in through the gates of the city by the power of the everlasting gospel, that is, by Christ himself. And so Psalm 46 starts off with a very, very famous verse that is used in so many songs. Certainly all of you can remember a song or two that have used these words. God is our refuge and strength. That is the protection of salvation by the cross, resurrection, and presence of Christ. A very present help in trouble. The trouble was death, separation from God. Therefore, we will not fear, though the earth should change, and though the mountains slip into the heart of the sea. I want you to remember that Jesus spoke about this faith of a mustard seed, and he said, you can pray for this mountain, and it will be thrown into the sea. And then we see that in Revelation, the mountain was thrown into the sea. Why? Because they prayed that it would. The mountain was the mountain of pride of the Pharisees. Their false, their apostasy, their false religion, their claimed attachment to Moses and Abraham, though really it was idolatry. They were worshiping and serving the creator, or the creation, rather than the creator. That is the creation of the law. That's what Romans 1 is about. And so they prayed that this, Jesus told them, pray and this mountain will be thrown into the sea. And so in Revelation, that's what we see. It's the answer to the apostles' prayer of the Pharisees and their false system being destroyed. And so that's what this is pointing to, and that's what those passages point back to, is Psalm 46. Though the mountains slip into the heart of the sea, in other words, we're going to lose all of national Israel and the physical temple and that which we have held on to for so many centuries. Though its waters roar and foam, though the mountains quake at its swelling pride, there is a river whose streams make glad the city of God. None of us can miss the fact that this is Jesus, or at least we shouldn't. This is the same river of life of Revelation 22. This is the same bellies flowing with rivers of living water of John chapter 7. This is the springs of water that we see in John 4 that Jesus would give to the woman at the well. This is the fountain opened up for sin and uncleanness. Definitely the living waters of Zechariah 13 and 14. So it's so beautiful. There is a river whose streams make glad the city of God. Well, the joy and gladness comes from the cross and risen life of Christ and his presence among us. It says, in your presence is fullness of joy. We see that, we've seen that in some of the early Psalms. And so this presence, this river of life, is the presence of God. It makes glad the city of God. And the Bible says we are the city of God. We have come to the city of the living God. Hebrews chapter 12 clearly teaches us that. We have come to the heavenly Jerusalem, the holy dwelling places of the Most High. So in this city are the dwelling places. As John 14 says, the mansions, which is translated actually dwelling places. That it says, in my Father's house are many mansions. So again, we are the dwelling places, the city of God in which are God's dwelling places of the Most High, it says. God is in the midst of her. she will not be moved. That is the stability and foundation of Christ as our rock, our fortress. We cannot be moved. The Bible says the wicked one cannot touch us. God will help her when morning dawns. That's the strength. The day star has arisen in our hearts, according to 2 Peter. The nations made an uproar. The kingdoms tottered. He raised his voice. The earth melted. Very similar language to Psalm 18. This is just what we call apocalyptic language. It says the mountains melt, the earth melts. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. So this is, without a doubt, a psalm of protection. How? Through the presence of God, the rivers that make us glad. Come, behold the works of the Lord, who has wrought desolations in the earth, in the land. And this was, God is glad for us to look back on what happened to Israel in the first century. He wants us to acknowledge his victory, his showing the blood of Christ as triumphant, as the accepted eternal sacrifice once and for all. He wants us to look back on that and say, yes, that outward destruction of the Jewish temple was the sign of his inward presence and his accepted sacrifice, that he came out. He went into the temple after the pattern of Leviticus 16, offered up the sacrifice, sprinkled the vessels, which were his people, the first century people who were coming to faith, and then came out of the temple as that sign. And in the Old Testament, he would come out of the temple, but he could never bring anyone back in. But in the New Testament, he came out of the temple, and that was the destruction of the Jewish temple. So he came out of his heavenly temple to destroy the national physical temple, and then brought all of his people into that. And so now we are in the midst of God. And so, come behold the works of the Lord, which he has wrought desolations in the earth. He makes wars to cease to the ends of the earth. The Bible says they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. He has caused war to cease. They will learn war no more. Why? Because we're at peace with God. He says, cry unto my people that our warfare is over. Isaiah 40. The enmity between God and his people has ceased. He breaks the bow and cuts the spear in two. He burns the chariots with fire. Cease striving and know that I am God. Cease striving. Be still and know that I am God. That's just that, there was such unrest in their lives as they were attempting to work hard enough to gain the favor of God. He says, I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth. The Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our stronghold. What a wonderful psalm of protection. It's incredible. We're protected from everything, including ourselves. The heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked. Who can know it? Jeremiah says. But because of the stronghold of Christ's finished work and his risen life and presence in our lives, we have this stronghold and refuge, and we will never be moved.